I'd like to welcome you to the first of two modules on poverty in the United States. As with the module on income inequality, here again we have some of the top experts in the country weighing in, with the result being a compelling, and I think alarming, portrait of poverty in the United States. We're going to start off this module by providing a primer on measuring poverty in the United States. If you want to understand poverty in the United States, you're going to have to understand how we measure it, no matter how banal or tedious that may be. We'll begin with Lindsay, discussing the country's official poverty measure, or OPM for short.
As it turns out, the official poverty measure is pretty straightforward to calculate. There's no real rocket science here. The official poverty measure, or OPM, is first calculated by determining how much income each household has. Once you've figured out that income number, you figure out if it's enough to cover the cost of basic necessities, things like food, shelter, utilities, clothing, and the like. If your household's income isn't enough to cover these basic necessities, then it's assumed that you're going without them, and you're therefore considered in poverty. By this very simple measure, about 15% of the total population is poor, and about 21.8% of all children. As you can see from the figure, poverty has declined precipitously since the 1960s, given the rapid economic growth and the expansion of our safety net. Since then, there's really been no clear trend, with poverty increasing during recessions and then decreasing during economic booms, like that of the late 1990s. Should we be satisfied that poverty hasn't increased all that much in the last 4 to 5 decades? After all, income inequality has increased spectacularly during that period. So maybe we should count it as an achievement. We've really dodged that bullet. But that's actually the wrong way to think about it, because the OPM measures an absolute standard of living that was established over a half-century ago. These results imply that for the bottom 15% or so of the population, the standard of living is just as dismal now as it was a half-century ago. For this bottom group, time has simply stood still. And that's a spectacular failure, given how much richer our country is now than it was.
Hold on, Lindsay. I think maybe you've gone just a bit too far here. After all, the skeptic might very reasonably point out that the official poverty measure is a lousy measure because it doesn't take into account much of the work that the safety net does. It's quite possible that once the effects of the modern safety net are properly factored in, a more sanguine conclusion will present itself. It's useful at this point to introduce a new and improved measure of poverty, one that's only quite recently been rolled out, a measure that's called the Supplemental Poverty Measure, or SPM for short. Let me tell you why I love the SPM so much. It provides a more authentic measure of poverty for 3 main reasons. First, and perhaps most importantly, it provides a better measure of family resources, as it counts not just the cash benefits that families receive, but also the non-cash benefits, like the Earned Income Tax Credit and like food stamps. This is important because the safety net is increasingly based on just such non-cash benefits. But that's not all. The SPM has other advantages too. It not only adds in the non-cash benefits that families receive, but it also subtracts out the non-discretionary expenses that families must cover. Expenses like commuting, healthcare, childcare, expenditures that simply must be covered in order to live, in order to work. Because there's no getting around these expenditures, the money used to cover them isn't available for basic needs. Hence, that money should be subtracted out before we calculate the family's available resources. The final virtue of the SPM is that it adjusts for regional differences in the cost of living, and in particular the cost of housing. In many urban areas, the rent is so high it can drive you into poverty. As a result, you can't cover your other basic needs because the cost of shelter is just too high. The SPM takes these differential housing costs into account by raising the poverty threshold in these high rent zones. So those are the 3 virtues of the SPM. As you can see, I'm a bit of a fan. But here's the key question. What happens when these 3 adjustments are made? Some of which work to raise the poverty rate, others of which work to lower it. We see here that as with the OPM, the SPM goes up in recessionary periods and comes right back down in expansionary periods. But superimposed on this cyclical trend is an overall downward movement between 1967 and 2000. Moreover, in the period since 2000, the SPM is flat, whereas the OPM is increasing. The overall conclusion, the trend line isn't quite as dire as the OPM represents. The non-cash side of the safety net has worked to offset what would have otherwise been an even more disastrous situation for the nation's poor.
Okay, David, enough with the numbers. Let's get back to the videos, where we'll learn more about the experience of poverty. Here's the roadmap. In the first video, Sheldon Danziger asks whether the war on poverty was indeed lost, just as the conventional wisdom would have it. Next, Kathy Eden asks how poor people make ends meet. We then turn to Robert Sampson's discussion of poor neighborhoods and show why some poor neighborhoods work better than we think, while others live up to all of our worst images. Then Annette Lareau compares the parenting in poor and middle-class households, showing us just how different those two worlds really are. And Matthew Desmond asks how poor people find and keep housing. And finally, it's back to Kathy Eden, because she's such a superstar in the field. And her latest work on why poor parents decide to have children is another landmark contribution. We of course know that poverty touches many. As you watch these videos, we hope that you'll do so with a critical eye, asking whether they're consistent with the poverty you may have experienced, the poverty you've seen, and the poverty that politicians and others often talk about.